If they came up and they were $50 short in the register, all the accountants aren't going to jump up from the restaurant and come and try to fill in and help out. It's sort of a mentality and a camaraderie that comes with it.
Hey, empowered survivors. Welcome to the Let's Heal Show. I'm your host, Beth Jones, aka the Healing Mentor. My mission is to inspire and mentor other survivors of trauma and abuse as they walk their healing pathways. I'm here to help you become fiercely devoted to your healing, turning your pain into your power. That's why this show is all about healing. And through our guests, we will explore healing in action. Sometimes I'll share my journey. Other times we'll hear from fellow survivors about their transformational healing experiences, bringing purpose to their pain and shining light in the darkness of this world. We'll also have conversations with gifted healers and learn about various resources and tools from those who support us on our journeys. So come on, everybody, let's heal. Everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Let's Heal Show. I'm very excited to have my guest today, Brian Botig. And Brian, I hope I said that correctly because I don't know if I've ever heard you say your last name before.
You said perfect.
All
Absolutely.
right, all right, very good. I'm happy about that. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure, Beth. One, thank you so much for having me on here today. This is a long time coming from earlier conversations that we had, but I'm a 32-year veteran of law enforcement, was a university, city, state, and federal officer. Spent 24 years with the FBI, and through the course of that, I drug my family, moving every 2 years across the country and really across the globe. We were stationed over in London and Canada for a while, so I've got five children and a beautiful wife, ranging from ages. Oh, my wife is. I won't go to her age. My children are ranging ages 21 to 9, and my oldest, who's in college now, she's a senior. She spent between kindergarten and 12th grade, went to 11 different schools, and went to high school in 3 different countries. So a lot of stress on the family from moving around, a lot of excitement and entertainment. And then spent a few years consulting and just out and doing a couple other opportunities now, but a lot of workforce wellness talks that I try to still deliver to the first responder community, which is both law enforcement and healthcare along in those fields.
So I don't know that we've ever talked about similarities of paths. So do you know that I grew up in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, multiple
I did
countries?
not. I knew you were worldly. I just didn't know exactly where. So
Yeah, the Middle East and Southeast Asia for all of my school years, from kindergarten through high school, and then moved back to the US to go to university. So look, there's another
yes.
similarity in our path. So I do like to talk for just a little bit about how I'm connected to the guests on this show, because I don't believe that there are any coincidental meetings for the most part in our lives. And as you mentioned, we've been trying to get to this point for a little bit now and figure out how we're going to work together and collaborate. And hopefully, this is the start of more to come for us. But I think so. We worked together for a brief time at FTI Consulting, which was both of our former employer now as consultants. And I think we met maybe right after you came on board, around the time that what I call the Cliff's Note version of my story came out in a book called Step Into Your Brave a couple of years ago. And maybe that was the first time that I guess I would say maybe you took notice of who I was, because it was very public about the launch. And that's how you saw me. You're like, oh,
I think, yeah, we were up in Toronto together, I believe.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So we had an opportunity to just chat about some of the experiences that we've had. And I was inspired by everything that you do from a workforce wellness, as you just mentioned it, a perspective. And so it's sort of what we're going to talk about today. So I feel very fortunate to have met you, and I love the work that you do. I think it's super important. I think what you do, particularly with law enforcement and what you focus on, is the reality of the manifestation of the job on us. And in that workforce in particular, it's quite difficult and can be very challenging. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Stories are often about pain to purpose. A lot of the people that I meet have a pain to purpose journey, which is my journey, of course. But one of the things that I find interesting about you, and also think about it in the context, which I think we've talked about, first mountain versus second mountain work. We've talked about that before in a book that I read called The Second Mountain that really inspired me. And you have it now. You're reading it, David Brooks. It's an amazing book and explained to me my life going from first mountain, which was that consulting world, to my second mountain, which is what I do now as the healing mentor work and really trying to spread my healing message broadly to people. Some people are born on second mountain, according to David Brooks, and you seem like you might be a little bit more of that type of a person who just naturally has that in you. And so just talk a little bit about that. I know you're reading the book now. I don't know where you
Yeah.
are in the book, but that concept of pain to purpose versus just being in life with a purpose, how that sits with you. Talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, of course. I grew up in a family of servants. I mean, my father was in the Air
Mm.
Force and then spent a career in the Coast Guard. My mother was a nurse. Going generations back, I've got four generations of law enforcement, a lot of New York City cops in my family, and then a lot of nurses and healthcare professionals. A lot of my family members are military. So I got into policing when I went to college. I was 19. I started policing before I was even old enough to carry a gun. It was kind of
Mm.
interesting working there. And that's all I ever wanted to do was be able to serve other people. And I just loved being in law enforcement. And I think that's where sort of our conversation goes a little bit today with how that impacts you mentally over time, just working in that field. And it wasn't until about 15 years into my career that I even realized the toll that the career was taking on me. But then I went out and was doing consulting for a little while and just I find the purpose in just wanting to help other people. That's what I was able to do that in consulting when clients had issues, but there's certain communities that I like where I have a better fit with, and those would be the healthcare and the first responder law enforcement community, probably because that's what my family history is, and I feel like I have a sense of duty to them for a lifetime. So
Yeah, I find that it is inspiring to me. You've always been in that place of service. And as you mentioned, you come from a long family of service, of sort of in your DNA to be service oriented. My experience with that, and particularly as I've thought about that the second mountain journey and my second mountain journey, you mentioned what I consider my first mountain work, which was the consulting work. We did help clients. And I suppose in a way we did serve with what we did because quite often the work that I did for years in that environment and the work that you did for a few years in that environment was really about helping organizations to deal with what we used to call sort of bet the company experiences. So it was really difficult things that they were dealing with, and in many cases threatened the lifeline of the company and really, if not dealt with appropriately, could have been traumatic for the company, right? Taking it down. And then you have the employees, customers, clients, employees in particular, who get affected by those types of things. So I have thought about that I've not been completely void of service work in my life. It's just a
well,
different mind frame of thinking about it.
there is a people don't recognize this, and a lot of the work that I was doing was in cybersecurity, so a lot of
Yeah,
ransomware, but that ransomware, even though it has a very technical business end to it, there's a victimization of people that work
absolutely.
there. I mean, they're
Yeah.
potentially going without a paycheck because the HR system is locked down, the payroll system is locked down, and there's people that have, spent their entire career and now they feel like, why is somebody victimizing me? So there's a whole mental aspect to even the cyber crime and incidents that happen at businesses that impact the employees in different ways. So yeah, it's a great sense of service to the clients there as well too.
Yeah, I I agree with you. It's just I had to have a mind shift to think
Yeah,
about that more for myself. But I mean, I'm on the accounting side of it, the forensic accounting side, and some of the cases that I worked on. I mean, everybody who's listening to this knows Enron and Bernie Madoff, right? And those are the types of
yeah,
cases that we worked on at FTI. And so everybody knows how devastating that was to the people who were victims of
right.
those. Essentially, they were crimes, and there were a lot of victims, a lot of employees, and a lot of investors who suffered. So there is some service work there when you're trying to do the work to help to unravel it and repair
Exactly.
the damage and to help. I don't think people are ever made whole after that, and certainly not in those two cases, but to help with some sort of, I don't know what the word is, right? Making people feel like they've had some sort of answer at least for what happened. So it was a mind shift for me thinking
Yeah.
about where I'm going to stop. But what I do now, I feel much more like I'm in service to people today and much more, broadly. So I think I'm more aligned with how you've always viewed it from a service standpoint. So let's talk about that a little bit, the work that you do in workforce wellness, because you have been focused on law enforcement, and that's natural because of your background and where you spent so much time professionally. And I've had the opportunity to work with law enforcement professionals throughout my lifetime. And of course, you hear stories about what happens to them from time to time. I think our media is really good at sensationalizing the side that's sort of the not so great side of what people want to focus on within law enforcement. Of course, law enforcement is there to serve and protect and to help us, but the media does a good job of bringing out the things that aren't so great. And all of those, there's a reality to what law enforcement professionals are dealing with on a day-to-day basis that I don't think the public probably has front and center in their mind, right? And you've experienced it and you've worked with a lot of people in that profession. So can you just talk a little bit about the reality of that?
Yeah, it's really funny because I went through this career and I can have a conversation with my peers about things that if I start talking about them, other people will just sort of gasp. And I talk about them so nonchalantly. And in the FBI back in 1999, I went over to Kosovo with the United Nations on a forensics team. And I casually talk about exhuming 260 bodies, hand shoveling and digging up bodies to do forensic examinations.
Hmm.
And other people just gasp at it. And it's just, that was just a routine of
Yeah.
everyday work. And I was a first responder to the Pentagon, and I look back on some of the things that we went through there, and those first couple of days, the Pentagon was still on fire, and they were shooting fire hoses, so there was just water and just in a
You tried
mess of
9/11.
water, plane parts and body parts. And I
Yeah.
just talk about it like it's
Yeah.
business. And so it's funny how that you sort of become a little bit jaded or
Almost
not
detached.
so, yeah, detached from it. I spent the first part of my career in uniform as a patrolman, and I absolutely loved it. There's a great camaraderie that came with it. The people that I worked with were people who would give up their life for
Yeah.
it's so different from other professions. It's funny because you mentioned your role in accounting, and I have my undergraduate degrees in accounting, and all my college roommates are all accountants and not cops. So I tend to joke about them and stuff. Like if I was at a restaurant and a fight broke out and the cops showed up, I would jump in and try to help out, no matter what situation I was in. Where I joke with my friends, I say if they came up and they were $50 short in the register, all the accountants aren't going to jump up from the restaurant and come and try to fill in and help out. It's sort of a mentality and a camaraderie that comes with it. But
Yeah.
there's something very, very appealing to that. There's very few other professions where someone is willing to, if you're in trouble, they're going to come and potentially give up their life for you. So you build this camaraderie with these people. The
Yeah.
downside of that is you tend to start isolating other people in your life because they're not that incredibly committed to you. Your
Yeah.
accountant friends aren't going to jump in and save your life if you're drowning or in a shootout or something like that. So you become very dependent on these people, and you end up very narrowly focusing your life just around these people and around this career. And life changing to me was I heard a speech by Dr. Kevin Gill Martin, who was a Pima County, Arizona sheriff's deputy. I think he was a sergeant, but he was also a doctor. And he wrote this book called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement Officers and Their
Mm.
Family. And when I read the book, I said, oh my goodness, that is me to a T.
Mm.
And basically, what he says is, why is it? He takes you on that journey in law enforcement where you get sworn in the first day and you have this smile on your face and you're so dedicated to changing the world and making the world better. But then, just like you said, where the media now capitalizes on cops, why are they so angry and bitter
Yeah.
and malcontent after 5, 10 years? Because they're tired of dealing with people and their problems, and they've isolated a lot of their other. It's just there's a whole culture of activities that happen in this career where you isolate your other friends. You only hang out with your cop friends. You only talk about cop business. You become very cynical. You stop wanting to get engaged in other activities. I remember I used to love mountain biking, and I stopped mountain biking because I didn't want to go out to the place where most of the people mountain bike, because everyone was out there drinking and smoking marijuana back in the day. And as a cop, I was like, oh, now I've got to deal with that. So I you stop doing your hobbies, and you just become very much focused on just your career, and your career becomes everything about you.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's so many parallels to what you've just said, what you experienced and what I experienced for different reasons, but that self-isolation where you just sort of let go of everything that's nourishing to you that you need as a human being in order to actually thrive in your life. And we don't even realize it's happening to us, right? It's so subtle, but over time, and I'm similar to you, over years, mine wasn't just about the career and the work I was doing. Mine was also about my personal circumstances. But it's so easy to just shed the things in our lives that create well-being. And I think ultimately what happened for me and what it sounds like for you, that word detached, but I also heard you describing pretty much being emotionless, right? Because even when you were talking about what you did in Kosovo and what you did at the Pentagon after 9/11, those were horrific things that you were dealing with, and you can talk about them with not much emotion, right? Which I'm the same way.
Yeah.
I can talk about my experiences and I tell people it's actually, I think, one of my gifts, and maybe it is one of your gifts as well, as being able to very openly share with people what you've experienced when it's not good without it triggering you or having an emotion in the moment, right? I can tell people the facts of my life, like telling them my hair's brown and my eyes are green, right? Which
Yeah.
that's good when I need to set the stage about what I've been
Right.
through, but it's also not good when you think about the fact that means that I really have not a whole lot of emotion to that. And that's actually where I found myself when it came my time to heal, and turning my pain to purpose was about being very emotionless, right? And I realized I just stuck all those emotions. They were still in me. I just stuck them into these boxes in this wall around me and had never dealt with them. But feeling that, being in that detached, emotionless state, I can definitely relate to that.
I think the problem with, and you mentioned it being a subtle change, is the change also feels right. So
Hmm.
when I started the police department, and then I was surrounded by these people who would give their life up for me. We worked 12-hour shifts, and then we'd get to our shift 2 hours early. So we'd go work out at the gym together. So I was spending 14 hours a day with these people, 4 days a week, and then many of my off days. And it feels right because you feel like wow, I'm getting accepted into this career. The more that I'm giving, I can work more. And when I go to work, everybody loves me and we have a great time. And so you
Yeah.
end up going to work more and it feels like perfect
Oh,
career
yeah.
development. You're like, really, I am moving along in this. And then at some point you hit burnout. And it was funny, there was, as a shift, we would work 4 days on and 4 days off. And after our last fourth day, when we got off at 5 in the morning, most of the shift we would go out to breakfast together at this one restaurant and we'd sit around. There was one guy who didn't ever come. And at the time, I'm a young 22, 23, very, very young. And I was like, oh, why doesn't he come? He doesn't appreciate this team. He's not one of us. It's like, because he wanted to go home and be with his wife. He'd
Yeah.
spent enough time with us. But as a young guy, I wasn't married at the time. So it was all about this team and this camaraderie. So as we would all go to breakfast, we would say, why isn't this guy here? He's not committed to this. He was just going home to his family. Now, ultimately, I stayed at that police department 3 years. He stayed there 20. So at the end of the day, who was more committed to it? He was actually just more balanced and able
Yeah.
to come in and do this as a job and then go home and spend time with his family and do other things. Where got to 3 years. I was just like, I need more, I need more, I need more. And I ended up changing agencies and going to a state police agency and then going to the FBI. So my career worked out okay, but I look back at those breakfasts. He's like, I just spent 12 hours with you guys working. Why do I want to spend another 2 hours with you? I want to go home. I've got a family. And I didn't have a family, so I didn't understand it at the time. But I look back now and I realize he was more grounded and
Yeah.
was able to leave and just put it behind and go do these other things in life that made it so much more important. But
Yeah.
it's funny the retrospective looking back on. But at the time, I thought everything I was doing was right, and what he was doing was shunning the team and everything else. But it's just interesting.
Yeah. I had the same experience with my career of in the moment over the years, thinking that what I was doing was the right thing for a variety of different reasons, right? I mean, I was successful, and just because of my natural success, I was moving up and progressing through the organizations that I worked for, which meant more responsibility, more accountability. The job gets bigger, it gets harder. I was traveling a lot domestically and then internationally for the work that I was doing, and it just evolved. And I thought I was doing the right thing for the job, the right thing for my personal growth, although I think I thought about that less, but I also thought I was doing the right thing at home because I became the financial provider in my household about halfway into my career. And so that sort of became part of that was my role and one of the identities that I wore in my marriage and in my family life, right? And so I thought I was doing the right thing, but then I came to a point where I realized that actually all of that had been a mask, part of the mask that I wore over the reality of my life and what my personal life was, and everything that I was holding inside of me was really covered up and masked by all of that. So in the end, probably wasn't doing the right thing by myself. So I'm curious about your experience. I don't think we've talked about this before, but like all those years when you're working, and obviously we're going to come around to the self-worth portfolio, which I think is something you've thought about for a long time, but what was happening at home, like your family life? What was happening there? Were you getting that right mostly, or was
Yeah,
that challenged?
I was very fortunate when I was a university, city, and state police officer. I wasn't married, so getting called out, working Thursday, Friday, Saturday night back in those days was very exciting.
Yeah, of
That's when all the great stuff was
course.
happening. I was in a college town, so it was exciting. And it wasn't
Yeah.
until I joined the FBI that I ended up meeting my spouse. And initially, when I was working, my first assignment at the FBI was working the kidnappings and murder of U.S. citizens overseas, mostly Middle East, Africa, Europe. And so I did a lot of travel. And it's funny, that Kosovo trip was interesting because I hadn't met my spouse at that time. And they'd set up a satellite phone. This was back in the 90s, so before cell phones and Wi-Fi and everything else. So I had a satellite phone set up. They said, look, we're paying for this 24 hours a day. Just call your family and let them know that you're safe. And it was my turn to use the phone. I didn't have anybody to call. I was just calling high school buddies. They're like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm in Kosovo. They're like, why are you calling me? I'm like, I don't know. They said use the phone. So I didn't, there was no responsibility at home. And then, so I was doing a lot of traveling, going overseas a lot. And then I met my spouse and decided I didn't want to travel as much. So I ended up changing squads to something with a little less, overseas travel. But then we got married in 2001. Then we had the attack on the 9/11 attacks, then we had the anthrax attacks, then we had the DC Beltway
Oh,
sniper.
really
So
quick.
it
Yeah.
was a very, very busy time.
Yeah.
Uh, and then my different assignments, my wife was tremendous in supporting me because we would up and move every 18 months, 2 years from DC. We went out to California, then came back to DC, went out to Oklahoma City, back to DC, up to Buffalo. So we were moving, and my spouse was really very supportive of it and very supportive of the service. She's very service oriented herself. And there was that time that I heard Dr. Kevin Gilmartin speak, and he gave this talk, and he was like, people that are just so obsessed with their career that it becomes their whole identity. And I was like, wow, so many of the things that he mentioned was just me. And I thought, I do not want to end up at the end of it goes into the self-worth portfolio that you mentioned. And I broadly say it, if I was your financial manager and I told you, here's your financial portfolio, invest everything you have into one thing,
Yeah.
you should look at me and say, that's not a good idea because if that one thing fails, then I've got nothing. And so for your self-worth, what value you have to this world shouldn't all come from one thing. You have to have a diverse self-worth portfolio. It should be made up of your career should be part of it, no doubt about it. Being an FBI agent was certainly part of who I was, and I see people who it's everything that they are. And
Hmm.
they do that at the neglect of their family, their spouses, their children, their friends, their hobbies, their interests. Giving up mountain biking was one of those things. I gave that up. I guess I gave up that slice of my self-worth portfolio of the interest in mountain biking. It had extended what I was getting at work. What made up my work portfolio was so much greater. And then there's a time when you look around, you realize you have nothing in your life but work. And you sometimes don't really have control over whether I worked at FTI, whether I worked in the FBI, or I worked at Dairy Queen. At the end of the day, it's all about it's a paycheck, and the paycheck
Yeah.
looks exactly the same. It is a job. Now, the FBI is a very, very noble job. I don't want to take anything away from it. The FTI job was very valuable to its clients. Dairy Queen's very valuable to its customers. I don't want to take anything away from the job, but they are all just jobs, and you take out Social Security, taxes, and everything else. So when you look at it sort of in that perspective, you don't want to make that everything about yourself because you could turn around tomorrow and your job's gone. And then you want to be able to fall back on, okay, I've got this relationship with my spouse, my children. I have friends outside of work. I have interests or hobbies that I can engage in, religion, faith. We were just talking before we started on self-care and
Yeah.
making sure that you take care of yourself. You get to the doctor. You're involved in exercise and other things. So having a diverse self-worth portfolio. So when one of those things fails, if your marriage falls apart, that's not, you have other things to, okay, I can go to work a little bit more, try to work on the relationship with my friends, or if you break up with a friend or something like that, you don't ever want to see them again. You have other things in your life to do. And if you lose your job, you have these other things that you're able to fall back on and be successful. So having that diverse self-worth portfolio, but you have to force yourself to do it. And this is where I go out and give this presentation to law enforcement officers, and I will go through the presentation and every one of them will nod their heads like, yes, that's me. That's me. And the problem is then they'll leave that presentation and they'll just go back to doing what they were doing. So I always invite spouses and teenage kids to come along as well too, because then they will hold them accountable for doing those things that we said in that presentation. Say, remember that guy said you have to have friends outside of the police department? That's why you're going out and the guy will roll his eyes. I don't really want to hang out with so and so tonight. Then you go and you end up enjoying it. So
Yeah, I love how you describe it, the self-worth portfolio and diversifying that, right? Because everybody can understand that in terms of, so we think about it sort of financial diversification of our investment portfolio.
I would literally take a piece of paper when I would go and just have a circle in it, and I would have the people draw a pie chart and say, draw what makes you up, and try to do it in percentages. And a lot of times you'd have the people put down work 40%, family 20%, woodworking or whatever hobby they have 5%, working out. And then you'd have their spouse or their children do it, and they would draw that same pie chart of their either husband or wife, whoever the employee was, and you'd see some dramatic differences in it, where somebody thought they spent 90% of their time or 40% of their time at work. The children would draw it and say, Dad, you're at work 90% of the time, you're at the gym 9% of the time, and you're home 1% of the time. That's, well, that's not what I thought. So probably foster some ugly discussions, but at least some honest discussions between the family on how they feel and what their perception of what your commitment is to those other pieces of the portfolio.
Yeah, it's a sobering reality when you see other
Yeah,
people's perceptions of who you are and where you're spending your time, right?
exactly.
So your self-worth portfolio, I really like it. It's a different way of describing what I think of broadly as the concept of love, which I spend a lot of time telling people that the reason why we should heal from what we've experienced in our lives is love, knowing love, and really truly experiencing that. And when I'm talking about it, I mean it across a wide range of relationships, including the relationship with ourself, which is where things like the self-care and diversifying what you do from a self-care perspective comes into play. So it's a lot of parallels between the same concept, just talked about in different way. At the end of the day, it's all relationship based though, right? Because even that self-care piece, it comes back to self-love and your relationship with yourself, which I think is important. So it's cool. Your way of just a different way of describing what I think about the same way. So when you work with people, the pie charts, and you're in that place of helping the people that you work with to understand that they might need to do a little work on diversifying their portfolio, how does that progress? Other than the family accountability, which I think is a great strategy, but how does that progress?
Kevin Gilmartin talked about a principle called retroactive satisfaction. And that is doing something that you don't necessarily want to do, but you should. And when it's all over, you'll feel better about it. And an easy example is working out. Oftentimes, I really don't want to do this 6-mile run today, and you dread it, and then you go and do it, and when it's all done, you're like, wow, I'm so glad I did that. You feel physically, mentally better after it's done. So you get the satisfaction doesn't come until it's over. And so
empowered. You started to use that word. I love it. Empowered.
So an example that I used to give is when I was in Oklahoma City, and that's when I first heard Dr. Gilmartin. I came home from work, and my children were very young at the time, and they would meet me at the door because they loved me and they wanted to see me. And when I came home, I really had two options. One was to say, give me 5 minutes to go take off my clothes and get changed, or when they run to the door and they've got a book in their hand, Dad, could you read me this book? Quite honestly, I didn't want to read the book because I really wanted to take off my suit because I didn't want to get pizza fingers all over my suit and have to pull my tie and everything else. So I really wanted to go change, but I could, and I knew the best option was to sit and say, "Oh, you want to read this book? Let's read this book right now." And I could invest 5 minutes in time right there. And I've read The Bear Snores On, 100,000 times. So I know how the book's going to end. It's not like it's anything new to the kids, but that's the book that they brought. So you sit and you read it. And I have the option to say, "Hey, give me 5 minutes," and 5 minutes will turn into 30, and then we probably will never get around to it again because they're no longer interested in it. Or I can say, "Yeah, I don't want to do this right now. I want to get changed, but I'm going to do this." And then I'll read them the book, and then they're happy because I did exactly what they wanted me to do. And then for the rest of the night, I get to go around and go, "Man, I'm a good dad because I made that choice to do this. I invested that 5 minutes." So the satisfaction doesn't come to, while I'm reading the book, I'm like, I just want to get out of this suit. I'm tired and everything else. But you have to force that investment. And I'm not a big extrovert, so I'm not a big Halloween party guy. My wife is much more social and enjoys being around people a lot more than I do. I remember one time we went to a neighbor's birthday party. It was again in Oklahoma, not birthday party, a Halloween party. And I'm not one for dressing up in costumes, but I forced myself into a Lone Ranger costume. I put on a cowboy hat and a blue shirt, and I think I even wore my FBI gun. Now, it was Glock, not what the Lone Ranger was carrying, but. And I went to this party, and when it was all over, I was like, that wasn't too bad. And my wife was happier because I went to it. I really didn't want to go, but when it was all over, I was like, that wasn't too bad. And that fosters. So you have to engage in these activities that you don't necessarily want to do. That they'll be good for you, they'll be good for your family, and then the satisfaction comes after.
Yeah, so it's choice, right? That's what you're talking
Yes.
about, is making a choice. And quite often to make a choice to do something that's contrary to our nature, but you do get that satisfaction. There's immediate feedback because you see in the two examples you're given with your kids and reading the book to them and your wife and going to the Halloween party, you see their joy, they're happy, and there is feedback that you get from that, right? That's nourishing.
Yes,
Yeah, right. So you do
absolutely.
get return on your investment, right?
It is, yes. You struggle to want to do it, but you'll always feel better after you've done it.
To us two nerdy accountants talking about
Yeah.
return on investment. Who would have thought? That's the world that kind of the world that we come from. I think it's a great concept and really has a lot of value to think about it that way. And I've thought about it a
Yeah.
lot since we've talked about it in the work that I've done to diversify my own self-worth portfolio. But for me, I had to go on a long journey of really digging deep, self-discovery, healing myself. It's been about a long journey. It was a hard journey, about 9 months of really intense work to take off those masks that I talked about before, right? The career mask and also the mask of being somebody's wife and that whole world that I lived in at the time, which wasn't great for me. And I really wore it as a mask more than anything else. But that self-discovery work sometimes can be challenging. And for me, when I think about the early days of that, because of where I was, had pushed so much out of my life, as we've sort of already talked about, which is what happens to us. I really had a hard time even identifying what is it that I need to bring back into my life to diversify myself so that I get to that place where I have joy, I'm thriving in my life. So it is some work to go and uncover that. So I've had that experience. So I don't know if you've experienced that
Yeah,
with people on going through that process.
those investments change over time too.
Sure,
So
that's true.
the things that make up your portfolio, 30, 40, if in the 80s you were investing in Beanie Babies, that was probably a good investment. If you're still investing in Beanie Babies, that's probably not a good idea. So the same with some
Yeah.
things that I was involved in, when I was, you know, in my early 20s, investing in,
Mm.
mountain biking or other things that now at my age, I might break my neck or end up in a knee surgery. So you're constantly reevaluating
That's your
the
risk
investment.
profile, your risk
Yeah,
tolerance coming into play there.
yes, the physical risk tolerance.
Yeah.
But yeah, you constantly are evaluating these investments that you have, and at some point, and if divorce becomes one of them, that's an investment that you end up having to let go, but you've got
Yeah.
to fill it back in with other things there. So it's not here's my chart of what I am. Like the FBI used to be a big part of my life. I've been retired for 2.5 years now. It's really, other than going to retired agents luncheon and keeping up with a couple friends, it's less than a 0.5% of my portfolio these days, where at one point it was 40%. And you need to be prepared to make that change when that's done and put that behind you, and then find new investments to put into. So the new investments of different career opportunities that I have, that I've taken, and then I'm going, looking into doing and investing in those, and seeing if they work. But you never want to just stay stable with, okay, this is my hobby, so I have to do it.
Yeah, constantly growing. I think that's one of the
Yeah.
things that is a gift that's available to each of us as human beings, is that we can constantly evolve and grow and learn and expand. And I think we just stagnant if we're
Yeah.
not doing that type of thing. But that too, it does take work and some effort and sometimes pushing your comfort zone, right? Which I also
Yeah.
experience
And,
from time to
and
time,
take
but it's
and
great.
taking an honest look at your investments as well too.
Yeah.
So Kevin Gilmartin used to talk. Another, when I give that pie chart, we draw that out. I have one circle, then I'd have three
Mm,
blanks on either side, three lines on either side of the page. And at the beginning of the presentation, I'd have people say, "Hey, write down who your three best friends are, and then write down what three of
yeah.
your hobbies are." And as we would go through the presentation, I would say, okay, are your three best friends all coworkers? Are they all cops? And for the most part, I tell them, don't put down spouses, girlfriends, boyfriends, or children, but friends. And for the most part, your cops, the only friends that they have are other cops. And then for hobbies and interests, Dr. Gilmartin used to call it the Eustace disease. You say you'd have this list of, oh, mountain biking, rock climbing, and whatever it may be. And you say, well, when's the last time you went mountain biking? I used to go all the time, but I haven't been in like 7 years because there's drug dealers out there and everything else. So it's not really a hobby if you haven't done it in 7 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can't just say, oh, and I see your pictures that you're posting. You're doing a lot of national park and exploring parks of Texas.
Love it.
You can't say, I like going outside and I like camping if you haven't done it in five
Yeah.
years. You
Yeah.
have to actually do it to make it a worthwhile investment. You can't
Yeah.
just fill it in on your portfolio so that you feel good that you've got a diverse portfolio. Really reconcile, do I actually do that? Is that something that I'm really invested in, or am I just saying that so that I don't show 90% work and 10% working out?
Yeah. Not so long ago, had you asked me that question to write down my three best friends and my three hobbies, my paper would have been blank.
Yeah.
Which is not a great thing to say, but that's
No, no.
literally, I'd lost everything about myself at that point in my life. It was right as around the time just before I turned 50, which we've talked about. I had a life-altering event, which is what shifted me and moved me into this place of transformation to go and do my work on the diversification of my self-worth portfolio, starting with myself. But literally before then, my paper would have been blank. And I would have been in a place of realizing this is not good. I can't
Yeah.
answer a pretty simple question here on best friends and hobbies, right? But that's literally where I would have been, which is terrible.
And that's why I love giving this presentation, not to dime people out, but just to force that record. Because there were
Yeah.
times in my
The
law enforcement
recognition,
career,
we go, oh
I
my
couldn't,
goodness. Yeah.
I couldn't have put down anybody who wasn't an FBI agent or a cop. And
Yeah.
even the people who I was putting down as best friends, okay, I haven't talked to them in 5 years, or I haven't talked to them in 10 years, but they'd be there for me if I needed to. Now so I force myself often in these. It was last weekend, I reached out to a guy who lives just north of me here, who I knew when we lived in Virginia. And I said, hey, let's go have breakfast together.
Yeah.
So I said, I'm not going to ask you anything. Just let's go have breakfast. I know I have to force myself that retroactive satisfaction. I'd rather
Yeah.
just sit home on a Saturday morning, but I need to get out and have meaningful relationships with other people
Yeah.
to ensure that I have a diverse self-worth portfolio and I can fall back on these friends should I need something.
Yeah. I used to, back in at that time, talking about if you'd asked me that question, of course, I spent most of the time with my work colleagues or my husband, and I wouldn't have put any of them on that list for
Yeah.
different reasons. My work colleagues, that was really about this world that I used to live in, where I think you had to have, for me, I needed complete separation of my personal and my professional life. And I'm sure there are reasons for that inside of me that I haven't explored yet.
Yeah.
And maybe someday, I don't know. But literally, I was in this world for a long time where you were either on social media, you were either a Facebook friend or a LinkedIn friend, right? A very clear delineation. And I remember the first person who I allowed to cross over, right? And that person was somebody who started to help me see people in that crossover world, right? They could be the work colleagues, but they could also be friends. Part of that was also that I wasn't in a place where I had the ability to share really much of anything about me. And that's just part of my story and my journey that I've been through. But it definitely would have been one of those questions that would have given me pause and made me think, and of course, on the hobby side too. One of the things that I've been most blessed with as a result of going on my healing journey is to do what I call reclaiming relationships. And that has been part of my own diversification of that self-worth portfolio. And for me, it's been going back and pulling in these people in my past who I'm now learning would have been on that best friend list. A lot of them, if I would have given them half a chance, right? But I didn't do that for my own reasons. But people who are amazing, wonderful, interesting people. And I'm sad that I lost all of those years and really getting to know them and having them in my life to feed me, to nourish my soul and help me be diversified, more whole, to feel loved, right? But it's been a true blessing to me to be able to go back and what I call reclaim them, right? And it's work. When I was asking about like how do you get started and how do you move down that path? I mean, for me, I've literally had to go to many of those people and say to them, this is why, right? You were in my life at one point, and either I didn't allow you to become deeper in a bond with me, or I just pushed you out altogether. Here's the reason why, and I'm sorry about that. Let's start over,
Yeah.
right? And I've been blessed to have people go, "Oh, it's you're back. You're amazing," and I'm happy to do that. So it's been a real blessing for me. That's helped me to see myself in a different way, which I think is part of that for me, the whole concept of love and this diversification of the portfolio, it has to start with self. And that's been a way of that return on
Yeah.
investment, that immediate return on investment when I do that for people to say, oh, you're amazing. And I'm so happy you're back. So I think it's important to see it that way.
It's so funny you mentioned that because just this morning I was at the dentist and I've neglected a little bit of self-care for a while. So I went in and I told the lady, I said, my kids and my wife have been in here. I've been so busy. I haven't been in here long enough. And she said, her answer was, it's okay. You're here now. And I thought, I was
Right.
really struck. I said, how welcoming is that? Because she could have, she said, no, it's okay. You're here now. And the same thing with going back to these friends who, you may not have seen in
Mm-hmm.
20 years, but if you go back to them now, if they're welcoming, then that's great. If they're not, then maybe they don't belong in the portfolio. Maybe there's investments
Yeah.
to make otherwise. So you give it a shot and you try, but that welcoming attitude was just, it was so opening. And I can see that going back to even, I'm doing the same things now. I'm reaching out to people since a lot of us have now retired from the FBI. There's a group of people that I still remain in touch with who I realize I'm genuinely good friends with. We went through a lot,
Mm.
a couple of them we've been
Yeah.
through shootings together and major incidents together. But now another part in life where we're not doing any FBI work and we're dealing with kids going to college and spouses' illnesses and second careers. And so there is a good group of friends that I have from my law enforcement community that I stay in touch with, and we're friends not just because we'd be there for each other in a shooting or something, but because we genuinely have the same interests and a genuine concern for each
Yeah.
other's well-being in the future.
Yeah, yeah. So we reconnected recently because you put a post out on LinkedIn about work-life balance. And I wrote back and I was like, oh no, we've got it all wrong.
Yes.
It should be life-work integration, which is what I truly believe. And that sent us down the path of talking about your work around workforce wellness and helping
Yeah.
focus on law enforcement. But I think the principles that you teach are broad to every single professional out there who's doing whatever we're doing in our work and our careers, right? And finding that balance. I truly do. I think work-life balance is kind of cliche to me, and that's conveniently worded by the
Yeah.
employers, right?
Right.
And I think to me that's part of the challenge we have with having truly inclusive and diverse workplaces where people feel like they actually belong because we don't quite have it. I mean, if you think about a 24-hour day and people say you work, 40 hours a week, which that's not your experience, it's not my experience, right or wrong, that's a whole different topic about how many hours, how many days, how many hours a day you work, but let's just say it's the 8, right? So that's 1/3 of the hours in a day are work. And I'm a proponent that you probably shouldn't get too far off of that for
Yeah.
a variety of different reasons. So really life is more than work, which is why I think
Yeah.
about it from a life work integration standpoint.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that because I did a lot of reflecting after we talked, and you're very unique to the police culture. I like the balance because and I do consulting now with law enforcement agencies, and one that I'm talking with now is whether or not the city should have a residency requirement for officers.
Mm,
I am completely opposed to residential requirements for police officers that you have to live in the city that you police because I want you to turn it off. That is a tough job to be on 24 hours a day. And again, I keep going back to Dr. Gil Martin, but he talks about this hypervigilance biological roller coaster where you're on duty. And when you're on duty, you're alive, you're alert, you're energetic, you're humorous, you're running around. That's what I was with when I was with my peers. That's why we became so close and had such great camaraderie because we were there and we had to be on our A game. You had to have that officer. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So then when I go home, I'm no longer alive, alert, energetic. I am tired, isolated,
Yeah.
detached. I don't want to read my kids that book. I just want to go sit down for 5 minutes. So over the course of a career, work gets the best of you, family gets the worst of you. So that's part of this balance and understanding what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And there are
Mm-hmm.
cities that want their police officers to live in the city because, oh, you live here, and if there's an incident, we want you to be able to respond. No, it goes back to this Dairy Queen, FTI, FBI thing. It's just a paycheck. You don't expect the sanitation workers when they're not working to go pick up, if they see a garbage in the
Yeah,
road, pick up
sure.
garbage. And you don't have that expectation of them. The police officers need to be able to completely detach and say, I'm not policing here. I'm not having to be thinking that somebody is going to shoot me, when I'm sitting at this Starbucks over here. I want to go away where you're not recognized. You can just be with your family in this different world so that when you come to work, you're giving work your all. And when you go home, you're giving work your all. Because if you're bringing work home with you, then that's going to disrupt your personal life. I think the
Mm.
best employee is somebody who has that ability to come to work and give you 8 hours and not talk about their personal life. And then they can go home. And if work is good enough and their boss isn't crazy or micromanaging or whatever they're doing, then they can go home and just talk about family things. They don't have to complain about work. So
Yeah,
you get the best employee who comes to work for 8 hours, 12 hours, whatever the shift or the requirements are, and they give you 8 or 12 hours of work. But I've had people that were in the FBI and they would work 15, 16 hours a day. And people would say, oh, they're tremendous. They're in here till 8 o'clock at night. I said, yeah, they're here 15 hours a day. They're only giving me 2 hours worth of work. Their personal life's just so bad. They just don't want to go home. So they just hang out here where it's everybody's alive, alert, energetic. It's a good
yeah,
feeling here. And then they don't want to go home because it's a disaster there. So sometimes the people that are there 14, 15 hours a day, it's not that they're greater workers than anybody else. It's just that they don't have anything else, or what else they have is broken and they just don't want to face it. So understanding what they do. So I really like police officers who can end their shift, go home, and don't have to worry
yeah,
about living in the city. And again, whether you want to live in the city or not live in the city is a personal choice, but I don't think it should be a requirement. I think you should be able
yeah,
to go
yeah.
away to an oasis where you're not running into the people that you're arresting. It was very hard for me in a small college town to go to a McDonald's and not see somebody who I'd arrested either eating there or working there. And you're like, now, they're
Right.
clearly going to recognize me. I'm not eating here. So it became
Yeah,
difficult to live, but you
yeah,
had to always be alert. It's nice to
yeah,
just sort of get away from that and completely detach from it.
yeah, yeah. No, it's a great example of having that complete separation. And you're throwing in there also that investing in the diversification of yourself, right? And what you were saying
Yes.
is amazing. I laugh every time when you say Dairy Queen, FBI, FTI, I laugh. And the reasons why I laugh is because my very first job in college, my very first paying job when I was in college, I worked the drive-through window at a Dairy Queen on an interstate here in Texas. And I knew from that experience that I was going to get my college degree no matter what. So I was not stuck working at Dairy Queen for the rest of my life. And then I worked for FTI, the consulting
Yep.
company that you were at for a little bit where we met. I worked for them for almost 20 years. And for years, people would always go, the FBI? And I'm like, no, not the FBI. I don't carry a gun. I do investigations in other ways. It's different. So that it makes me laugh because I always dealt with that explanation of who do you actually work for, FBI or FTI? So which you probably experienced too.
It
Like,
was it was
are
confusing
you
at
now?
times too, yes. So
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, it is. Like this has been a wonderful conversation as it always is with you. I love chatting with you. You're so inspiring to me. And I'm going to connect in the show notes on this. So the book that you keep referencing, Kevin Gill Martin. So we'll get that
yes.
out there for people to find it. But before we end, just quickly, do you want to mention Global Trace and where people can find you if they want to connect with you for a variety of reasons that we've talked about on this chat?
Sure. I have a website at globaltrace.llc, and it's just really a way to contact me and look at some of the services that I'm doing. A lot of it is this workforce wellness talk. I like to get out to different
Powerful.
groups. This serves well in groups that are service oriented, medical staff, police officers, fire, military, and it just gives that opportunity to have somebody address the reality with you that maybe, as you said, you don't have any friends, you don't have any hobbies, and all you have is work over here.
Yeah.
And FBI was a big part of my life. Law enforcement was a big part of my life for 32 years. And it's not any, I don't do anything with it now other than consult on it and or try to help cops where I can, but I'm not out policing the streets or anything. That left my portfolio. So just excited to always connect with you, Beth. I like watching, I like doing the outdoor stuff too. So I follow your Texas parks, although they're a little too hot for me. I prefer
Well,
the
you just got to get the time
Montana
of year
and the
right.
North.
No, my recent
So
ones were fantastic in October, early November. They're great.
it's
Yeah,
all timing.
it
So,
all
but
it is.
thank you so much,
So,
Beth, for this opportunity, and glad
so
to help
happy to
you
have you.
and
We'll
anybody
do
we
this
can.
again, I'm sure. Yeah, we will. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Beth.